When an elderly black man walked into an upscale restaurant, no one suspected his quiet presence would expose a shocking betrayal and bring an entire dining room face to face with the cost of prejudice. Robert Miller stepped through the entrance of Elite Eatery on a crisp evening. The upscale restaurant nestled in one of the city's most affluent neighborhoods. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city skyline glittered like scattered diamonds against the deepening twilight. Inside, soft amber lighting bathed cream-colored leather seats and pristine white tablecloths. The air hummed with the quiet conversations of professionals celebrating promotions, couples marking anniversaries, and families gathering for special occasions. This was a place where excellence was not just expected, but promised. Before we continue with this story, please write in the section where you are watching from. Do not forget to hit the subscription button for more engaging stories. Robert's appearance commanded attention, or should have. His silver gray hair was impeccably groomed, his dark suit tailored to perfection, the crisp white shirt and burgundy tie speaking of a man who understood the language of presentation and respect. His stride was measured but purposeful, his posture radiating the quiet authority of someone who had built something meaningful with his own hands. He was 73 years old, and every line on his face told a story of perseverance, sacrifice, and triumph. The hostess greeted him at the entrance, her smile polite but somehow hollow, not quite reaching her eyes. "Good evening, sir. Table for one." Robert nodded graciously. She led him through the dining room, past tables positioned beside the magnificent windows with their panoramic views, past the intimate booths in the center of the room, past the elegant bar area where soft jazz played from hidden speakers. She brought him to table 14, positioned awkwardly near the swinging kitchen doors and the service station where staff bustled back and forth with trays and water pitchers. It was a kind of table usually reserved for walk-ins on busy nights, not for reservations on a quiet Tuesday evening when half the restaurant sat empty. Robert noticed, of course. How could he not? But his expression remained unchanged, calm, patient, dignified. He simply pulled out his chair, settled into a seat, and accepted the menu the hostess extended with a brief, rehearsed smile. The first subtle slight had been delivered, though Robert said nothing. He had learned over 7 decades that sometimes silence spoke louder than protest. Kate Cooper, a waitress in her late 20s with auburn hair pulled into a sleek ponytail, was assigned to Robert's section. She wore the standard uniform, black dress with white collar and cuffs, and moved through the dining room with practiced efficiency. She glanced at table 14 as she approached, her eyes sweeping over Robert for perhaps half a second before her attention shifted elsewhere. She arrived at his table, her notepad already in hand, but her posture suggested she was merely checking a box on a to-do list. "I'll be with you shortly," she said, her voice flat and mechanical, offering no warmth, no eye contact, no acknowledgement of Robert as anything more than an inconvenience temporarily occupying her section. Before Robert could respond, Kate pivoted smoothly toward table 16, where a younger couple, perhaps in their early 30s, dressed casually in designer jeans and blazers, had just been seated. Her entire demeanor transformed. Her smile became genuine, her voice animated. "Good evening. Welcome to Elite Eatery. Can I start you off with something to drink? We have a fantastic wine list, and our sommelier just received a shipment of a beautiful Pinot Noir from Sonoma that pairs wonderfully with our filet." She laughed at something the man said, her body language open and engaging. Robert opened his menu slowly, his weathered hands steady. His face remained expressionless, but something flickered in his eyes, not anger, not surprise, but a deep, weary disappointment. He had seen this before, lived this before, fought against this before. He had simply hoped, perhaps naively, that the world had changed more than it apparently has. Or, at the very least, that the establishment he poured his soul into building would be different. He could hear Kate's animated conversation continuing at table 16, the couple's laughter mingling with the soft jazz. The menu before him featured dishes he knew intimately. The seared scallops with cauliflower puree, the duck confit with cherry gastrique, the wagyu beef with truffle butter. These were recipes refined over years, each ingredient sourced with care, each presentation designed to create an experience worth remembering. Yet here he sat, invisible, waiting for service that should have been immediate, watching excellence be extended to some while withheld from others. Minutes passed. Robert sat with his menu open, occasionally glancing up when Kate moved through his field of vision. She returned to the young couple, bringing them water with lemon slices and fresh bread with herb butter, taking their appetizer order with careful attention to dietary restrictions and preferences. She laughed again at something they said, leaning in slightly as if they were sharing an inside joke. She walked past Robert's table. Once. Her eyes didn't even flicker in his direction. She walked past again, this time carrying a tray of cocktails for a group of businessmen celebrating near the window. Robert could hear fragments of their conversation. A merger finalized, profits exceeding projections, bonuses being distributed. Kate set down each drink with a flourish, describing the ingredients and garnishes, making recommendations for dinner pairings. She walked past Robert's table a third time, now refilling water glasses for a family of 4, parents with 2 teenage daughters dressed for what appeared to be a birthday celebration. Kate chatted warmly with the birthday girl, asking about her plans, complimenting her dress. 20 minutes had elapsed since Robert was seated. His water glass remained empty. No bread basket had appeared at his table. No one had taken his drink order. He sat in quiet dignity, his hands folded on the table, his expression betraying nothing of the humiliation settling like a weight in his chest. Other patrons began to notice. A woman at table 11 glanced repeatedly between Robert and Kate, her brow furrowing with concern. An older gentleman at the bar caught his companion's eye and nodded subtly toward Robert's table, his expression darkening with understanding. Whispers began to circulate, discreet but unmistakable. The atmosphere in elite eatery, normally one of convivial elegance, took on an uncomfortable edge. 30 minutes. Kate continued her circuit through the dining room, attending to everyone except the man at table 14. She brought appetizers to the young couple, refilled drinks for the businessmen, delivered dessert menus to an elderly couple finishing their entrees. Each time she passed Robert, she found a reason to look elsewhere, adjusting her apron, checking her notepad, scanning the room for imaginary signals from other tables. Robert remained still patient, his dignity intact, but his heart growing heavier with each deliberate dismissal. He thought of the countless hours he had spent training staff, emphasizing that every guest deserved the same excellence, the same warmth, the same respect. He thought of the values he had tried to instill, the culture he had worked so hard to build. And he wondered how, despite everything, it had come to this. Across the dining room, seated at a prime window table with an unobstructed view of both the city skyline and the entire restaurant floor, Katrina Miller watched the scene unfold with mounting fury. She was 42 years old, impeccably dressed in a navy blazer and cream silk blouse, her dark hair styled in a professional yet elegant manner. She had arrived 30 minutes before her father's reservation, wanting to observe the restaurant's operations on a typical evening, to see through a customer's eyes how her staff performed, how the systems she'd implemented functioned under real conditions. It was meant to be a routine check before meeting her father for their monthly dinner, a tradition they'd maintained since she took over daily operations of Elite Eatery 5 years ago. She had not expected this. Her father didn't know she was here. They were supposed to meet at his table, and she'd planned to surprise him by already being seated with a glass of his favorite bourbon waiting. But now she sat frozen, her own meal untouched, her wine glass full, her eyes tracking every movement Kate made, or rather, every movement Kate deliberately didn't make. Katrina's jaw tightened as she watched Kate laugh with the young couple, her animated gestures and warm tone a stark contrast to the mechanical dismissal she'd given Robert. Her father had now been sitting at that inadequate table for 35 minutes without so much as a glass of water. And Katrina knew, she knew, that her father recognized exactly what was happening. She could read it in the set of his shoulders, the way his hands rested too carefully on the table, the slight downward tilt of his head that suggested a man trying to maintain composure in the face of deliberate indignity. Every instinct screamed at her to intervene immediately, to march across the dining room and confront Kate, to end this humiliation before another second passed. But she didn't move. Her father's voice echoed in her memory, words spoken years ago when she was learning the business. Never judge someone's character by what they say, Katrina. Watch what they do when they think no one important is watching. That's when you see who they really are. And once you see it clearly, act decisively. So Katrina waited, her hands clenched beneath the table, her breathing measured and controlled. She needed to see how far Kate would take this. She needed irrefutable evidence, not of a single oversight, but of deliberate, sustained discrimination. Because when she acted, and she would act, there could be no ambiguity, no room for excuses or explanations. Kate must reveal her character completely. But with every passing minute, Katrina's restraint became harder to maintain. Victoria Arrington, the restaurant manager, moved through the dining room with her usual meticulous attention to detail. She was in her late 30s, dressed in the manager's uniform of black slacks and a crisp white blouse with the Elite Eatery logo embroidered discreetly on the collar. She paused at various tables, asking about the food quality, ensuring drinks were refilled, addressing minor concerns with practiced professionalism. She passed table 14, noting in passing that the gentleman seated there had an empty water glass. A flicker of concern crossed her face. That shouldn't happen, not at Elite Eatery, but she assumed Kate was handling it. After all, Kate had been with them for 8 months, generally received positive feedback, and had never raised any red flags. Victoria made a mental note to check back in a few minutes if she didn't see Kate attending to the table. What Victoria didn't see was the pattern. She didn't notice that Kate had walked past table 14 7 times in the last 30 minutes. She didn't observe the deliberate way Kate's eyes slid away whenever she approached that section. She didn't register the growing discomfort among nearby patrons or the whispered conversations about the elderly gentleman being ignored. Victoria was competent, conscientious even, but she was managing 15 tables, coordinating with the kitchen, handling a minor issue with a wine order, and ensuring the evening service maintained Elite Eatery's sterling reputation. She could not see what Katrina saw from her vantage point, the complete picture of systematic neglect. Across the room, Katrina watched Victoria pause near her father's table, watched her glance at the empty water glass, watched her move on, assuming everything was under control. Katrina considered signaling Victoria, pulling her aside, ending this nightmare immediately. Her hand actually rose from her lap, ready to make the gesture. But she stopped herself, because this wasn't just about tonight. This was about whether Kate's behavior represented an isolated incident or a pattern Katrina had somehow missed in her oversight. This was about understanding if there were gaps in her hiring practices, her training protocols, her supervision systems. If Kate felt comfortable treating Robert this way, on what other occasions had she revealed this character? To whom? And why hadn't Katrina caught it before? So she waited, even as her fury built, even as her heart broke watching her father sit in dignified silence, even as every fiber of her being wanted to end this immediately. She waited, because understanding the full scope of the problem was the only way to truly solve it. But her patience was wearing dangerously thin. 40 minutes had passed. 40 minutes of Robert sitting at table 14 with neither food nor water, with no acknowledgement beyond that initial dismissive greeting, with nothing but his dignity to sustain him through the calculated neglect. Finally, with the quiet determination of a man who had learned that sometimes you must advocate for yourself even when you shouldn't have to, Robert raised his hand. The gesture was polite, undemanding, just a simple raising of his hand to shoulder height, attempting to catch Kate's attention as she emerged from the kitchen with a tray of entrees for another table. Kate saw him. There was no question she saw him. Her eyes flickered toward his raised hand, and for a fraction of a second, irritation flashed across her face, an unguarded moment where her mask slipped and her true feelings became visible. Then she pasted on a thin smile, the kind that didn't involve any facial muscles beyond the lips, and adjusted her course toward his table. She arrived with her notepad, her posture conveying impatience barely concealed beneath a veneer of professionalism. "Sorry for the wait," she said, the apology so perfunctory it carried no actual regret. "We're short-staffed today." The lie hung in the air between them. The restaurant was not particularly busy. Kate had not appeared rushed or overwhelmed. She had simply chosen, again and again, to serve everyone except the man at table 14. Robert, ever gracious despite everything, didn't call out the lie. He simply opened his menu to the page he'd been studying for 40 minutes and began to speak, his voice quiet and courteous. "I'd like to start with—" Kate cut him off mid-sentence, her tone sharpening with barely concealed contempt. "Actually, maybe you'd be more comfortable somewhere else." She paused, her eyes sweeping dismissively over his impeccable suit, his dignified bearing, seeing none of it. Seeing only whatever prejudiced assumptions had been guiding her behavior all evening. "We're a bit upscale here, and I'm not sure our prices." She didn't finish the sentence, because across the room, Katrina Miller rose from her seat. The movement was swift but controlled, the chair sliding back with barely a sound against the polished floor. Several nearby patrons turned to look, sensing the shift in atmosphere, the sudden charge of energy that preceded something significant. Katrina's face was a study in restrained fury, her expression composed but her eyes blazing with an intensity that made the ambient temperature seem to drop several degrees. She began walking toward table 14, her stride purposeful and unwavering. The sound of Katrina's chair scraping against the floor cut through the ambient noise of the restaurant like a knife. Conversations faltered. Heads turned. The elegant soundtrack of clinking glasses and polite laughter faded into a pregnant silence. Katrina stood for a moment at her table, her posture radiating controlled fury. Her hands were steady at her sides, her expression carved from stone. Then she began to walk, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor with deliberate purpose, each step echoing through the hushed dining room. She crossed the space between her window table and table 14 with the measured pace of someone who had spent 40 minutes containing an inferno and had finally decided to let it burn. Every eye in Elite Eatery followed her movement. Patrons sensed that something significant was unfolding, something that transcended the normal rhythms of dinner service. Kate, still standing beside Robert's table with her notepad and her half-finished insult hanging in the air, turned toward the approaching figure. Confusion rippled across her face as she recognized Katrina, the owner, the woman who signed her paychecks, the person she'd seen perhaps a dozen times in 8 months, but never in this context, never with this expression. Katrina stopped beside her father's table, positioning herself so she faced both Kate and the rest of the dining room. When she spoke, her voice was low but carried throughout the space with crystalline clarity. Every word was enunciated with surgical precision, controlled fury barely contained beneath a layer of professional composure. "I've been sitting across this room for 40 minutes, Kate." Katrina's eyes locked onto the waitress, who seemed to shrink under the intensity of that gaze. 40 minutes, watching you ignore this man. Watching you walk past his table 7 times. Watching you serve water and bread and take orders from every other table in your section while he sat here, without so much as a glass of water. Kate's mouth opened, closed, opened again. No sound emerged. The notepad trembled slightly in her hand. Katrina took a breath, and when she continued, her voice rose just enough to ensure no one missed what came next. "Do you know who he is, Kate?" Kate shook her head mutely, her face beginning to drain of color. "This," Katrina said, gesturing to Robert with a hand that shook slightly despite her best efforts at control, "is Robert Miller. My father." She paused, letting those two words settle over the room like stones dropping into still water. The man who built Elite Eatery 23 years ago with nothing but a dream, a small business loan, and the unshakable belief that every person who walked through these doors, every single person, regardless of age or race or appearance, deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. Kate's face had gone from pale to ashen. Her eyes widened with dawning horror. Katrina's voice hardened further, the temperature in the room seeming to drop with each word. "For 40 minutes, I watched you demonstrate that you don't share those values. I watched you reveal exactly who you are when you think no one important is watching. And I watched you finally approach this table, not to apologize for the inexcusable delay, but to suggest that my father might be more comfortable somewhere else. That this restaurant my father built might be too upscale for him. That he might not be able to afford our prices." The silence in Elite Eatery was absolute. Several patrons had tears in their eyes. Others sat with clenched jaws, their own experiences with discrimination reflected in Robert's quiet dignity. Katrina's final words fell like a gavel. "You're fired, Kate. Effective immediately. Leave your apron with Victoria, collect your final check tomorrow, and never set foot in this restaurant again." For a long moment, Kate simply stood frozen, her brain apparently unable to process what had just happened. Then the reality crashed over her in visible waves. Her face flushed red, then paled again. Her hands began to shake violently, the notepad falling from her grip and clattering to the floor. "I didn't," she stammered, her voice breaking. "I didn't mean I thought." The excuses died on her lips as she met Katrina's unwavering gaze. There was no mercy there, no opening for explanations or justifications. "Leave your apron with Victoria," Katrina repeated, each word clipped and final. Kate's hands fumbled with the ties of her apron, her fingers too shaky to manage the simple knot. It took 3 attempts before she finally loosened it and pulled it over her head. Victoria Arrington had materialized beside them, her face stricken with horror as the full scope of what she'd missed became devastatingly clear. Kate thrust the apron into Victoria's hands without meeting her eyes. "I'm sorry," Kate whispered, though it was unclear whether she was speaking to Robert, to Katrina, to Victoria, or to herself. No one responded. The apology was far too late, far too inadequate. Kate turned and walked toward the kitchen, her shoulders hunched, her head down. Every eye in the restaurant tracked her movement. The kitchen doors swung open as she pushed through them, and then she was gone, vanished from Elite Eatery as completely as if she'd never existed. Victoria stood holding the discarded apron, tears streaming down her face. She turned to Robert, and her voice broke as she spoke. "Mr. Miller, I am so profoundly sorry. I should have seen, I should have noticed. There is no excuse for what just happened here. None." Her professional composure had shattered completely, revealing genuine anguish beneath. "Please, let me personally take your order. And please know that your meal tonight, and any meal you ever have here, will always be on the house. It's the absolute least I can do." Robert had remained still throughout the confrontation, his weathered hands folded on the table, his expression unreadable. Now he looked up at Victoria, and his eyes were kind despite everything. "Thank you, Victoria. I appreciate your apology, though you are not the one who needs to apologize. And I will not accept a free meal. I came here to pay for dinner like any other customer. I just wanted to be treated like any other customer." Victoria nodded, wiping at her tears with the back of her hand, and pulled out her own notepad. "Of course, Mr. Miller. What can I bring you?" As Victoria took Robert's order with trembling hands and infinite care, something remarkable happened in the dining room. A man at the bar began to clap, slow, deliberate applause. Within seconds, others joined. The applause swelled, filling elite eatery with a sound of affirmation, of solidarity, of recognition that they had witnessed something important. Several patrons were openly crying. Others nodded with expressions of deep respect. Robert raised a hand gently, and the applause gradually faded. He didn't want to be celebrated for simply expecting basic human decency. But the message had been sent and received. This was what accountability looked like. This was what leadership looked like. This was what happened when values were not just stated, but enforced. Victoria departed to place Robert's order personally with the kitchen, her hands still shaking, but her spine straightening with renewed purpose. Katrina finally sat down across from her father, sliding into the chair opposite his. For a moment, neither spoke. The weight of what just transpired hung between them, heavy, but somehow cleansing. Robert reached across the table and took his daughter's hands in his. His skin was weathered, marked by 73 years of life, decades of hard work that built this restaurant from nothing. Katrina's hands were smooth by comparison, but they bore their own scars, the toll of 5 years managing elite eatery, navigating the endless challenges of maintaining her father's legacy while making it her own. "You did the right thing, Katrina," Robert said quietly, his voice carrying the gravitas of hard-earned wisdom. His stern expression, maintained throughout the ordeal, finally softened into something approaching pride. "You protected what we built here, not just the business, but the values, the foundation, the only things that truly matter." Katrina's eyes glistened, tears threatening despite her efforts at composure. "I should have acted sooner. I shouldn't have let you sit here for 40 minutes enduring that cruelty." Robert shook his head slowly. "You did exactly what I taught you. You let her reveal her character completely. Now there can be no doubt, no second-guessing, no wondering if you acted too hastily. You saw the truth and acted with integrity. That's all anyone can do." Katrina squeezed her father's hands, drawing strength from his presence. "You taught me that a restaurant isn't about food or decor or even location, Dad. You taught me it's about how people feel when they walk through the door and how they're treated from the moment they sit down until the moment they leave. That's the only measure of success that matters. That will never change here, not as long as I'm running elite eatery." Robert's eyes crinkled at the corners, the closest he came to a smile. "That's my girl. You understand. It was never about building a business. It was about building a place where people, all people, could feel valued, respected, seen. Where the quality of service didn't depend on the color of someone's skin or the clothes they wore or assumptions about their bank account. Where dignity was the foundation, not an afterthought." Victoria returned with Robert's drink, bourbon neat, his favorite, and set it down with such care it might be made of glass. "Your appetizer will be out in just a few minutes, Mr. Miller," she said softly. Before she could leave, Katrina gestured for her to wait. She glanced around the dining room, noting that most of the staff had gathered nearby, drawn by the commotion, standing in a loose semicircle with expressions ranging from shock to shame to determination. This was the moment for the lesson to be reinforced, for the values to be reaffirmed before W.